Welcome to my tent, and may I offer you a date in the tradition of biblical and the tent-dwelling ladies' hospitality. They're fresh dates from our palm tree. I say my tent because I was involved in the weaving of the goat's hair that made the tent, and I was also involved in making the furnishings, the carpets, the coverings, and all these things. And I have a particular part of the tent which belongs to me particularly and belongs to all the tent-dwelling women, and I'll show you that. And of course, when I speak of the tent-dwelling women of the Bible, I'm referring to Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, Rachel, the wives of the patriarchs, because they lived in tents, sometimes nomadically and sometimes in a more settled place. As I say, a special place here is the women's quarter, which is separated from the main tent by a curtain. Again, a curtain that I was involved in the weaving of the material for. And into there you have the ladies' quarters, and only the ladies are in there, except for my husband. And if any other man comes, he can be stoned to death for intruding. But this area is referred to in the scriptures, because in Genesis 18, when three visitors came from God to bring the news that Abraham and Sarah, despite their old age, would have a baby, would have the next member of the covenant, through whom the covenant would continue with Israel. He was to be Isaac. Sarah was listening to that message brought to her husband in the tent, and she would have been behind the curtain. And we know she was there because the Bible records, because it was such startling news, considering her age and that she'd been barren, she laughed. Laughed perhaps in unbelief a bit, laughed in fear, laughed in wonder and surprise. And yet she went on with her husband to know, as Isaac was born, that nothing is impossible with God. Well, I'm wearing a typical modern Bedouin, because Bedouin people live in tents like this in Israel today, a little bit different sometimes, because they'll have a satellite dish on the roof and they'll probably have a Land Rover parked by. I'm wearing a modern Bedouin dress bought in the Bedouin market in Jerusalem, but it's very typical of what the tent-dwelling women would have worn. A plain, probably black dress, black cloth that they would have woven themselves, but with an embroidered panel here. And that would have been something, if their dress wore out, they would take off and move on to the new dress. And always a head covering. And in fact, it's quite possible that the head covering would have covered the whole of the lady's face, apart from her eyes. And of course, that's how Jacob was deceived, really, by his father-in-law, in that he was expecting Rachel, but he was given Leah, and he didn't know, really. It was partly because it was the night as well, but she would have been covered up. And of course, the husband never saw his bride until they were actually married. Now, it's a very busy life being a tent-dwelling lady, both in Bible days and today, because the women did and do all the work, while the men are sat having coffee and talking and looking out to see if there are any travelers or any visitors, and perhaps discussing what might be going to happen, while the woman is working, and she has a number of daily jobs. One of the first things is to get the bread made for the day. Now, it isn't going down and buying a loaf at the supermarket or anything like that. She has to start with grinding the corn using this millstone. Very hard work. Now, we know that grinding corn is women's work because one of the things they did later in the book of Judges to Samson when he was captured by the Philistines was they made him grind corn. And that was a disgrace because it's women's work. And that produces a kind of flour, which we have here, not flour like we buy today, but a coarse kind of flour with bits in it. And that really comes into making a flat bread that's really flat like that and would be cooked on a flat oven dish over the fire, because you've always got to keep the fire going. Never let the fire go out. And as I say, our bread would be cooked on that. Job that has to be done daily. But also, of course, we do read again in Genesis 18, when those visitors came, Abraham recognized that they were important, these three. He called to Sarah to make 3 measures of fine flour and make it into a fine bread or cake. And that would have meant that the flour would not only have been ground from the corn, the millstone, but it would have had to be sieved, and really to get that fine flour. Of course, hospitality is very important. In Bible days and today, the Bedouin people always offer hospitality. And in fact, tradition was that you could offer hospitality and were expected to for 3 days to any visitor without asking any questions. They didn't have to declare who they were until 3 days were past. One of the other jobs, of course, is looking after the animals. Now, we would have some sheep and goats way out. They're out at the moment with being looked after a bit and roaming about. And of course, they have to be milked, and also, of course, they have to have water and make sure that they're getting pasture. And really the milk is very important because that forms one of our basic foods. And the milk will be brought, after it be milked, and put into this churn. And that, by swinging it about, that will turn this milk into a yogurt and then into a cheese, so that you have sheep's and goat's milk cheese, and we have some there. Because, of course, you see, it's so hot in the desert, and the milk would go off. Now, it is quite a job doing that, because we have quite a number of sheep and goats. Now, I have a little story to tell you that comes in the book of Judges. And it's telling the story of a lady called Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. And it was when Israel was at war, and an army had come with a general Sisera. Now that time, in fact, the Lord was with the army, and it was in the days of Deborah the judge, and Sisera was defeated. And as he was fleeing, so he came upon Jael's tent. And he came to her and asked for refuge, for sanctuary. And she took him in, actually. She actually took him right into her part of the tent. She knew that he was the enemy, and she saw an opportunity of really seeing how she could both make this man feel welcome and important and give him hospitality, but also how she could be used to defeat the enemy finally, because once the commander of the army was killed, the rest would flee and Israel would be totally victorious. So she took Sisera into her part of the tent. But to show him hospitality, she gave him a drink of what's called Laban, which is like a yogurt drink, a buttermilk, and it's very soporific. Well, of course, this caused him to go to sleep. Remember, he had been fleeing too, so he was already tired. He thought he was safe. He thought he had come to a place of refuge, but in fact he'd come to a place where he would meet his end, because as he slept, so she took one of the tent pegs, and she took the mallet used, or hammer, for banging them in, and she stood over him, and she banged this right through into his forehead, so that he died. And this is recorded in the book of Judges, in the Song of Deborah. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, most blessed of tent-dwelling women. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera, she crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell where he lay. At her feet he sank, he fell, and where he sank, there he fell dead. And that is the story of her courage and the fact that really she was instrumental in securing the final victory there for the Israelites over their enemies. One of the other jobs and one of the other main animals that needs looking after, of course, is this animal here, our camel. Very nice camel we have here. Doesn't spit too much, doesn't kick up too much, but of course it does need water, an enormous amount of water. Now, of course, water is needed not only for the camel and the sheep and the goats, but water is needed for the men's coffee. They may have 2 or 3 lots during the day. Water will have been used in some of the other cooking, and also for our crops of lentils and a kind of wild rice type of thing that would grow. And there might be also some mint and 1 or 2 other herbs and things. That's as if we're not moving on, if we're staying for a while. And I would have got my water early in the day before the sun got up. I might have had to trek quite a way to a well in this leather or goatskin bucket. Quite a job. And to keep some of the water cool, I perhaps would have put some of it into this jar, which could be buried partly in the sand, and I would fill up the water pots. I might also have taken a water pot to the well and filled it there and brought it back, carrying it on my shoulder. But one of the most important people to have water is the camel, and it would be waiting. Now, there is a lovely story about the watering of camels in Genesis 24. Abraham had sent his servant back to the land he came from, back to his own family, back to his brother's house, to look for a wife for his son, because he knew that his son, with whom the covenant would continue, the covenant that God had made, could not have a wife from the peoples around them, from the Canaanite people or from any other tribe's people. He must be apart and must stay with their own people. So Abraham sent his servant back. And the servant wondered, and he thought up a plan that he would go to the well where the women were getting water, because it's again women's work to get water. And we know that's right the way through biblical days, because when you come into the New Testament, one of the things that marked out where the upper room was to be for the disciples was that they would see a man carrying a pitcher of water, and that was the most unusual thing. The getting of water was always women's work. And so this servant thought he would go to the well and he would see who amongst the women was there, and would see what actually happened. He was very apprehensive. He was anxious to please his master, and he was anxious to do the right thing. Rebecca came out with her jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother, Nahor. The girl was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever lain with her. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again. The servant hurried to meet her and said, "Please give me a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. After she had given him a drink, she said, "I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have finished drinking." And this she did. And without a word, the man watched her closely to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. And he went on to find out who she was and that she was of the family and a fit wife for Isaac. And she agreed to return with the servant, to leave her family and to go. Then Rebekah and her maids got ready and mounted their camels and went back with the man. And so the servant took Rebekah and left. Now Isaac had come from Beer-lahai-roi, for he was living in the Negev. He went out to the field one evening to meditate, and as he looked up, he saw camels approaching. Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel and asked the servant, "Who is the man in the field coming to meet us?" "He is my master," the servant answered. So she took her veil and covered herself. Then the servant told Isaac all he had done. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah, so she became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. A wonderful story of God's provision and God's leading, but also showing too how as Rebekah went to fetch water and how she was prepared to provide water not only for the man coming but also for his camels. She was blessed and was taken into the people of God, was taken into that covenant family, and she of course would bear 2 sons, with one of whom the covenant would continue with, Jacob. Well, it's a very busy day for the tent-dwelling woman, very, very busy. And you must remember, while she's doing all these things, she's got to be looking out for visitors, and visitors not only have to have cheese and coffee. Admittedly, the husband would probably take and deal with the meat side, but she would have to provide bread and rice and butter, it speaks of these being brought forth in the scriptures when they had a feast or when visitors came. Very busy day. She'd got to keep her fire going and she'd got to keep her light going, which would have been really a type of oil lamp. And of course the tent-dwelling women of the Bible, in particular Sarah, was very subject to her husband. And we also know from the book of Hebrews that actually she, like Abraham, was commended for her faith. But in 1 Peter, when Peter is writing his letter and giving instructions to Christian women, he refers to Sarah and mentions the fact of her obedience to Abraham, of her reverence for him and her respect, and commends her and commends these qualities. And it just speaks of the fact that she was reverent and she spoke to Abraham as her master and her Lord. And he says Christian women would do well to be reminded of this and to show that proper respect. So, it's something of the life in the desert. A very busy life, a very busy day, a lot to do, a lot of responsibility. And Bedouin women today do that as well. And you see them if you go to a Bedouin encampment where you would see a similar tent. But I've spoken to you particularly of the kind of life that Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah lived, and those who came immediately after.